Thank you. Thank you. Oh, wow. Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and thank you to Hillsdale College for the invitation to speak here. I've been looking forward to this. Who here has heard of trigger warnings? Yeah. So it's mocked a lot by people on the right. Trigger warnings were popularized in universities and other left-wing spaces. Basically, it's just providing a warning, normally for things that may be triggering. So if it's like reading a story that has triggering language because of so-called homophobia or racism or anything, it's giving a warning. And oftentimes it's misused, and it's to make students quite snowflakey, but there's a place for it, actually. I'm going to give a trigger warning for this just because some of the images and videos I'm going to show as part of my presentation are graphic. And I don't do it to be sensational or shocking, but there's no way to report honestly about Antifa without showing what they actually do, which does result in maimed bodies and killed people. So many of you who heard of me probably first heard of me in 2019. You probably saw this photo or some variation of it in the mainstream media headlines. This photograph was taken on the 29th of June, 2019 in downtown Portland. You probably heard the story. I was recording a protest and riot by Antifa, as I had been doing for many years. And that day, in organized fashion, Antifa beat me severely. So the photograph, you see mostly all that liquid stuff on my face, but that wasn't really what caused the injuries. Injuries were the repeated punches to the face and head. I was in the hospital and diagnosed with a subarachnoid hemorrhage. I didn't know what that was. The doctor had to explain it to me in layman's terms. That's a brain bleed, and you can die from it. I survived, had about a year of various medical treatments to address the deficiencies that resulted from that. So this story has been on the record a lot, and I want to spend a few moments just to focus on other people who were injured on that same day. A lot of people don't know that in the course of that riot, there were 8 people who were injured. One other person is a man by the name of John Bloom. He was striked on the head with a baton by an Antifa militant in downtown Portland. Now, keep in mind, this was a riot that was pre-announced and pre-advertised by Antifa, and the city could not or would not respond to stop the violence. When I was beaten, it was steps away from the Justice Center, which is the building that houses the sheriff's office, the Central Police Precinct. So officers inside that building could probably see me, but I had no help. In addition to John Bloom, there was Adam Kelly. He was hit on the head with an overhead strike by Antifa member Gage Halupowski, who was using a collapsible baton. Kelly needed 25 staples to close the gashes on his head, and the beating was caught on camera. You could actually hear the sound of the baton hitting his skull. He was lucky to be alive. And here's the body of Aaron Danielson in downtown Portland. Last year, after months of rioting in downtown Portland, it escalated to murder. An Antifa member shot dead a Trump supporter. And in this photograph, you can see him on his shorts. He's actually wearing a patch of the thin blue line, which is showing support for police. Police were aware of Antifa's plans for violence in downtown that day, but they were nowhere near to help the people who were victimized and one person who was ultimately killed. So I show these images because I want you and viewers out there to understand that Antifa is not merely just an idea or purely theoretical. Their ideology and militant tactics have real-life consequences. It's resulted in destroyed livelihoods in terms of businesses that have been continually vandalized and destroyed over and over. It's resulted in maimings, and it's resulted in death. So who are the Antifa? What are they? There's a lot of misinformation out there on both the left and the right. I'll start with misconceptions on the right first. Sometimes you hear them described as if they were a single organization, capital A, Antifa. And that perception, I can understand why it exists because of how organized they are, and many of them travel to different parts of the country to engage in criminal activities. But there is no single Antifa. On the left, you hear them described as noble anti-fascists who are opposing racists and the far right and neo-Nazis. What you need to know about Antifa is that they are a transnational movement that espouses an extremist, communist, anarchist ideology. They merge the worst aspects of both communism and anarchy to form a worldview that criminalizes property ownership, wrongthink, and produces endless disorder and crime. They organize themselves via affinity groups connected through networks. Some of the Antifa groups have Antifa in the name, like Rose City Antifa, which I'm involved in a lawsuit with because that militant group in Portland was the one who organized the violence against me in 2019. But many Antifa groups don't have the word Antifa in the name. There's the Youth Liberation Front, which has cells or chapters across the United States, and they were involved in months of riot organizing on the West Coast throughout 2020. They advocate for and carry out acts of insurgency against the state. They hate America the most in particular because they see this country as, in their words, imperialistic and the head of a serpent that spreads and upholds fascism around the world. They don't just hate symbols of this country like flags and things that represent the rule of law like courthouses or law enforcement. They really despise the American philosophy, i.e. individual rights, the rule of law, and freedom of expression. An event like this could not be held in an area where they have significant control or sway, such as Portland. Antifa seek to make it impossible, literally, for conservative or right-wing people to participate in the public square in urban areas. That's why they beat and rob people for practicing their First Amendment rights. In left-wing urban centers under the control of weak Democrats, they're able to do it with impunity. And you don't have to have a controversial opinion to be in their crosshairs. I've seen them beat people for merely holding the American flag. And just over this past weekend, a church in the Seattle area canceled its event with TPUSA founder Charlie Kirk after Antifa threatened violence. You can think of Antifa as somewhat analogous to worldwide jihadism in that extreme Islamic groups or individuals inspire and incite violence against the infidel. Their followers may be formal members of groups like Islamic State, but more often they're simply followers of the ideology carrying out the call to violence. And like jihadists, Antifa honor and celebrate their so-called martyrs. And despite the long trail of evidence showing Antifa's involvement in organized criminal activities, which even the FBI director, Christopher Wray, admits is real, this is what you see when you read the legacy press headlines. Here's the Associated Press last year at the height of the riots. As Trump blames Antifa, protest records show scant evidence. New York Times, despite claims by President Trump and Attorney General William P. Barr, there's scant evidence that loosely organized anti-fascists are a significant player in protests. So journalists who have the benefit of a corporate media backing with huge resources came to these conclusions. Myself, just as an independent journalist, this is what I was able to find. So this is Amelia Shemrovitz. She, a male-to-female transsexual, was arrested in May 2020 in Portland as the George Floyd / BLM-inspired riots broke out. She was charged with felony arson, felony rioting, felony criminal mischief, and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit a Class A felony. Now, I didn't see this reported in the press, but I actually looked up her court records, and this is what the criminal complaint says. Quote, when her roommates asked how Shemrovitz started the fires, Shemrovitz responded by saying that it is not a conversation for Facebook Messenger and that she will be home soon. A subsequent in-person conversation occurred, and the roommates reported that Shemrovitz stated she started the fire using a Molotov cocktail, and she is part of Antifa. Shemrovitz was reported to be extremely excited about being labeled a terrorist and was very animated about her hopes that police officers would be killed and injured by the riots. She also stated that she would be going out on another mission and the goal would be to set another fire, end quote. That wasn't reported in the local and national press. And her charges were dropped by the district attorney. Here's another one. Howe, another male-to-female transsexual. This person, she's from Rochester, New York. She was federally charged in September 2020 with inciting or organizing a riot. Howe shared a homemade IED recipe and posted about arson attacks on her social media. I actually was able to find her account, which is under a pseudonym, and this was her profile photo. You won't see this in the headlines. Here's another one. Brittany Austin, another male-to-female transsexual. She also goes by the name Sumaya Dawood. She's a convert to Islam. She was arrested at a violent protest in Phoenix, Arizona last year. At the time of her arrest, she was carrying a AR-15. She was charged with felony, first-degree hindering prosecution, felony riot, unlawful assembly, assisting a criminal street gang. Some of the local reporting mentioned her as being part of a, quote, protest group, racial protest group. None of them mentioned what you see on the photo on the right, which is what I was able to find on her social media. Back to Portland. Jared De Ferrari, another male-to-female transsexual. This person came all the way to Portland from Sunrise, Florida. They also go by the name Sophie. She was indicted on 1 count of felony riot, 3 counts of felony first-degree criminal mischief. According to court documents, she destroyed property at St. Andre Bassett Catholic Church in downtown Portland. And there's video of it. This is a Catholic church that provides charity outreach to homeless people in Portland, which is a very large and vulnerable population. I'll show you the video, which allegedly shows Dave Ferrari at that Antifa riot. You can see people who have press markings walk right on by and don't photograph or record this wanton act of violence against the church that provides services to the homeless. Antifa is a contemporary phenomenon, but they do take the name, mythos, and symbols from an older organization. The Antifaschistische Aktion, or AFA, so you can probably tell from the name it's German. The original AFA was founded in 1932 as a violent paramilitary of the German Communist Party. They were involved in extremely violent political street brawls and systematically worked to undermine the social democratic government of the Weimar Republic. This was just shortly before World War II. Antifa won't admit it today, but their forebears actually paved the way for the rise of Hitler by creating a climate of extreme political polarization and instability. After World War II, the quote-unquote Antifa ideology of the communists was absorbed into the official state ideology of East Germany. In the name of so-called anti-fascism, the East German regime built the Stasi, which was the Ministry for State Security, where citizens were monitored and spied on through a vast apparatus of informants who infiltrated all aspects of life in civil society. The Berlin Wall, built to stop its own citizens from fleeing the tyranny of the East, was called the Anti-Fascist Defense Barrier officially by East Germany. A lot of people don't know that. Historically and today, quote-unquote anti-fascism or Antifa have nothing to do with actually opposing fascism. It is a cover for an explicitly far-left communist agenda. Most mainstream left-wing people are ignorant of this. This is why you have fools on CNN describing Antifa as comparable to American soldiers liberating Europe of fascism. In the same fashion, Black Lives Matter has nothing to do with racial justice, and is just a rebranded version of Black revolutionary Marxism seen in America decades ago. Antifa's far-left theories and ideology was able to slip in America through academics. Herbert Marcuse and other European Marxist intellectuals fled Europe in the last century and found a home in America's academic institutions. So things like critical theory, and from that, critical race theory, trans ideology, intersectionality, all that was born in America's academic institutions. And you can see the effects of it today in hollowing out pretty much everything that it touches. Discussing Antifa's origins and their ideology can be complicated to the layman. There's a lot of history there, there's a lot of terms and concepts. Antifa would rather we just take them at their word that they are simply anti-fascist. But if listening to what they say and write is too complicated, how about we just look at what they do when they're given the opportunity? This close-up is one of the barrier checkpoints in Seattle's Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone last year. To recap, that was when, for 3 weeks during the summer, the city allowed groups of armed left-wing militants to seize 6 blocks of city property in an area that is densely populated near downtown. Now, Seattle is the biggest city in the Pacific Northwest in America. We're not talking about a failed state like Libya or Somalia or somewhere else. This is America. The militants declared themselves sovereign from the US. You can see one of their signs here on the right. It says, "You are now leaving the USA." So I actually went undercover there. I wanted to see with my own eyes, can this really be happening? Because from what I was reading in the headlines, this was just a wonderful street party. This was protests in the street for racial justice. Well, when I saw there, they had multiple checkpoints all around those 6 blocks. This was one of the checkpoints, and they were manned by people who were armed with rifles and pistols. And police were chased out. It's Chaz, as it was known, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, was praised by the press. It was praised by Seattle City Council. And even the Seattle mayor infamously went on CNN to say that this could become a summer of love. But what happened in there was a zone of terror and death. In those 3 weeks, there were 6 shootings, arson attempts, an attempted rape, and 2 homicides. For a zone established to be a refuge for Black people, it had a 100% Black victim shooting and homicide rate. One of the victims who was killed was a 16-year-old teen. He was shot dead by the Chaz security. They mistook him for being a white supremacist when he was in the car. They shot dozens of rounds into the vehicle, and the one that likely killed him was the one that went through the windshield. I looked at the photographs and videos of the car. It was soaked with blood on the inside, and the evidence was destroyed by the occupants of Chaz. So to this day, police still don't know who killed that 16-year-old. It wasn't just Chaz, of course. This is a statue, former statue in downtown Portland. It's an elk statue. It was quite beloved by the city and its citizens. It was set on fire and destroyed. It was one of 8 statues that were destroyed in Portland, along with the statues of George Washington, Abraham, and Roosevelt. For more than 120 days, night after night, Antifa rioted in Portland. Minneapolis is probably what people think of when they think of where the worst rioting happened, just because actual full neighborhoods were torched to the ground. In Portland, we had a sustained violence for months on end that lasts continuously for more than 120 days, to which now it's still going on, but it's happening maybe 4 or 5 times a week instead of every night. That's the improvement we have in the city. So Portland is my hometown, and I was living and working there last year and seeing with my own eyes what was happening to my city in the course of writing my book, Unmasked. What I was seeing every night was organized mobs of rioters setting fires to buildings that were occupied by people. They came armed with weapons, really brutal but simple weapons, like knives taped to the ends of umbrellas, Molotov cocktails, other homemade IEDs, small knives, rocks, lasers used to damage the eyes of their opponents in law enforcement. We hear a lot about what happened on the 6th of January in DC. All the actions of that day and more occurred for months on end in Portland. Here's some undercover video that I recorded last year. So a barrier was erected to protect the federal courthouse, much like what we see in front of the Capitol today. And there were thousands of people who came night after night to try to burn that building down. They came with power tools, as you see here, to cut into the fence. And when that was unsuccessful, they later attached ropes around strategic parts of the fence and used hundreds of people to break it apart, which was successful. If you read the headlines at that time, they were echoing what the mayor, the governor, the 2 senators, and others were saying in Oregon, which is that these were protesters responding to Trump's Gestapo, secret police that were disappearing people. Those comments incited more violence and allowed it to continue night after night after night. Here's an attack where a masked militant threw a Molotov cocktail at a group of law enforcement. The individual here, after more than 6 months of an investigation, has been arrested and charged. He actually came to Portland all the way from Minneapolis, allegedly specifically for the purpose of rioting. 96 people have been federally charged. Around half have had their cases dismissed. The remaining have mostly had deferred resolution deals, which means that their cases are dropped once they complete some brief volunteer work. At the local level, we had more than 1,000 arrests related to the months and months of rioting last year. With our progressive district attorney, he dropped the cases of more than 90% of them. This is justice in Portland. For reporting on Antifa's violent extremism, I was beaten, as you know, and have been continually subjected to death threats. Antifa have showed up to my home to try to break in. They write things like that around the city. They've written my address as well in public. I have more than 24 reports with the Portland police. No one's ever been arrested. This is Michael Rhino. He's the Portland Antifa member who shot dead Aaron Danielson in downtown last year. He had run-ins with law enforcement on 3 occasions shortly before going on his mission to kill. The photo on the right, that was him getting arrested at a riot the month prior. You see that gun on the ground? That was his. It was illegally possessed. He was charged, and all those charges were dropped. And then he went on to kill. Portland's not really in the headlines that much anymore, but the violence is continuing. Just 2 weeks ago, Antifa again set the Portland Police Union Hall on fire. The photo on the left is some of the damage you see from that. When Derek Chauvin was found to be guilty on all the charges, Antifa in downtown Portland set buildings on fire. I'll read you one of the tweets from the official account of Portland Police, which were giving live updates. This fire is near an occupied building and a propane tank. At another riot, they went on to destroy a children's charity, and they also smashed up another church. What can be done? Well, my role as a journalist is more so to describe and inform people what's happening rather than to give solutions. So this part of the speech is probably the most challenging for me to write, and depressing, I think. I do think cities like Portland, Seattle, and Minneapolis, and others are possibly beyond saving. There's a critical mass of support for far-left extremism masquerading as racial justice in those areas. Notice I said critical mass, not a majority. You don't have to have a majority of people supporting what's happening. You just have to have enough, and there is enough of it there. And they vote for the politicians that enable it. Through violence, Antifa have driven out any meaningful opposition in urban liberal areas. This is a fight that liberals and the moderate left have to take on themselves. But if 2020 was any indication, that's not something they're willing to do. In fact, they're probably more likely to join in on the protests and volunteer themselves to stand in between the rioters and police. I predict further civilizational and cultural decline in the US as the critical theorists continue their successful efforts at hollowing out every institution they touch: academia, journalism, entertainment, government, military. Through the years, we've witnessed how far-left extremists like Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dohrn, Angela Davis, and Assata Shakur have been successfully rebranded into racial justice activists and academics rather than communist terrorists involved in bombings, shootings, and murders. Similarly, papers of record and politicians would have you believe that Antifa are just anti-fascists fighting neo-Nazis. I recently spoke on record about my decision to flee the United States. This has pained me a lot because my family found asylum here as refugees fleeing communist Vietnam. Both my parents were sent to prison camp in the 1970s. I'm continuing my reporting from abroad, resigned to believe that my home city is dying and that the disease killing it will continue to spread. I'm not sure what the antidote is, but I hope conferences like this will help inform the public about what to look for before it's too late where you live. Thank you.